Polls and research over the last several decades have revealed something that, we have probably all experienced to some degree in our everyday lives as Catholics. And that's that there is a great diversity among Catholic people over the whole world. Diversity of language, of culture, of backgrounds, of thoughts, of experiences. And we've also seen, too, that there's real division among Catholics. We think differently about things, whether that's in the political spectrum or beyond. Lots of things that kind of make us different from one another. And yet there is so much that unites us as well. We're united by one Lord and one faith and one baptism. We're united by one bread that makes us all into the Church of Christ, the ecclesia, the assembled people of God. But there's another thing that joins all Catholics together. And it doesn't matter where you fall on any spectrum. One thing that we all share in common is that we are just all downright weird. Every Catholic you've ever met throughout time is a weirdo. And I want to talk about one that takes it to the bank today. You may have heard me talk about him before, but I just love it, and I love to share his story. His name is Saint Simeon Salos, and he's just one of the weirdest ducks we've had in the history of the church. So he was born in the 6th century in the city of Edessa, which is found in modern-day Turkey. The city doesn't exist in its current form anymore, but modern-day Turkey. Now, he lived with his mom until he was 20 years old, at which time he and his longtime friend John both entered into a Syrian monastery, and they professed their monastic vows together. But from there, both Simeon and John traveled to the desert region near the Dead Sea, and they spent the next 3 decades, the next 30 years, living a life of simplicity and poverty, meanwhile developing a very deep spirituality. Now, when Simeon turned 50, he decided it was time to leave the desert, and he moved to the city of Emesa in Syria, where he began living a life dedicated to the care of the poor and the salvation of souls. Sounds pretty good, right? Fairly normal, a little odd who goes off into the desert for 30 years and comes out sane. That's a good question. But it gets better. Those 3 decades certainly had their effect on him. It made him humble. It made him grow close to God. And he wanted to make sure that when he got into the city, that he wasn't going to lose that humility or that closeness to God. And so Simeon did something that would be weird even by our standards as modern Catholics. He presented himself in the city as a bumbling fool. He didn't live or behave like other people around him, and he'd often be found doing some of the most outrageous things, and he quickly became the joke of the town. Sometimes he'd walk down the street and he'd pretend to have a limp, and other times he'd just start jumping up and down the street. Imagine looking out on Main Street and seeing somebody do that, right? You start to wonder, who do we call? Sometimes he would trip over himself, and other times he'd throw himself to the ground and just start thrashing about. On one occasion, he walked into the church and he extinguished the candles on the altar, and then he began to throw nuts at the people who were sitting there praying. This is certifiable stuff here, guys, right? And on another occasion, and this is kind of gross, but he was even found dragging a dead animal through the street on a leash, right? Everyone thought Simeon Salos was insane. And because of this, like we often do, we take the people who don't fit in, the weirdos, and we marginalize them. The people did that to him. They sneered at him, they insulted him, and it was the 6th century, so they even subjected him to beatings. Simeon caused quite a stir in the city of Emesa, and that's how he got his name, Simeon Salos, because in Greek, the word salos means to stir. But as he endured all of this, and he did so intentionally and with great patience, he realized that he was free to go about doing the work of God without people gawking at him or making a big deal about him. So at nighttime, when nobody else was around, when everyone thought Simeon is just being his crazy self, he was on the outskirts of town, and he was taking care of the poor, and he was preaching the gospel to the lowly, to the other weirdos of society that nobody had any use for. And it is even said that he cured diseases, that he worked miracles, and that he helped the sick by his prayers. But because he deliberately acted like a fool, nobody in the city ever expected anything great from him. And so nobody was looking for him to be holy, never mind a saint. And that's what gave him the freedom, unencumbered by a puffed up pride or out of a sense of doing things so that other people would see him doing it, that he was able to make a difference in the life of the people in the city. And it was only after his death that Simeon's secret came to light, when his old friend John shared who Simeon really was. And it was then that the people of Emesa learned that they had been wrong about him. They had called him the crazy monk, and they began to venerate him as a saint, and affectionately called him the holy fool. Let no one deceive himself. If any one among you considers himself wise in this age, let him become a fool, so as to become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness in the eyes of God. These are the words of St. Paul to the Corinthians in our second reading today. These are the words that settled firmly into the heart of Simeon Salos and defined his life. And these are the words that should cause us to stop in our tracks today and evaluate our lives as Christian people. Are we deceiving ourselves? St. Paul says, let no one be himself deceived. Are we deceiving ourselves when it comes to our faith? Are we trying to have our cake and eat it too? Are we seeking to deepen our love for God while simultaneously trying to earn the praise and the respect of other people? Are we really fools for Christ, seeking to grow in his wisdom? Or do we consider ourselves wise in this age? Where are my priorities? Where is my heart? What do I value most in this short life I have? For 2,000 years, people have attempted to follow Jesus without becoming fools. And really, that brought them not much more than a Christless and a crossless social ethic. It doesn't fill them with happiness or joy. But our readings today, all of them, call us to more. They call us to enter into the paradox that Jesus reveals to us. A paradox that the wise and the learned will shirk, but the fools and the little ones will embrace. They call us, even 2,000 years later, into a new and radical and heavenly way of life, into a life that will inevitably be seen as foolish by those who fashion themselves as wise. How can we not be fools in the sight of this world when our Lord and Master was seen as the biggest fool of all? The gospel presents to us a consistent picture. God's plan for us, for our salvation, was and is infinitely more reckless, more absurd, and more foolish than even the bumblings of St. Simeon Salos. From the very beginning, that God would create a world to love him that he knew would so often not. Foolish. That he would decide to enter into our midst and take on our frail flesh when he didn't have to. That's foolish. That he put the burden of his plan for salvation on the shoulders of a young teenage girl. That's foolish. The God of the universe would make his dwelling in her womb. becoming a child born into poverty, and then subjecting himself to the cruelties and hardships of this world, that's foolish. That God in the flesh would bother walking around Galilee, changing water into wine, multiplying bread and fish, spending his time with the stinky poor and the meek and the lowly and the sick and the forgotten. That's foolish. That he would tell his followers, as he tells us in our gospel today, to turn the other cheek when wronged and to love our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us. It's foolish. And that he would actually expect that all of humanity would follow his commandments, that we would live lives of selflessness and sacrifice, and that to love God and to love neighbor would bring us the greatest joy, not the accumulation of wealth or success. That's foolish. And that he would then allow his own creation to nail him to the wood of the cross. It's foolish. That he would agonize for hours on the cross and die one of the most embarrassing, horrific, and painful kinds of death. That's foolish. That he would rise from the dead, reveal himself to a few, including women who nobody had any use for at that point in time, then ascend into heaven and expect that people would follow him despite the fact that they could not see him. It's foolish. That he would establish a church that would be necessary for our salvation, and yet filled with a bunch of sinful, hypocritical people. Foolish. Every bit of it, my friends, everything that brings us here this morning is foolish. And yet, every bit of it is wonderful. Now, maybe you've struggled with how foolish it is. I know that I certainly have. Because there's a big part of me that doesn't want to be foolish. I want to be just like everybody else. I don't want people to think less of me. I don't want people to think that I'm a fool. I want to be just like everyone. But you know, it's precisely when we can become okay with being foolish, with being weird, with being different, we find everything that our hearts are looking for. And it's only when we embrace the foolishness of our God and our faith and this wacky, weird, crazy, awesome, loving church of his that we'll finally be able to see reality, to see truth, and to see what we often typically think is wise really amounts to a hill of beans. Now, I'm not suggesting that any of us live like St. Simeon Salos, but I am suggesting that we all authentically live our Christian lives, and that when we do that, if we're doing it right, we are inevitably going to become, at least in the eyes of the powerful and the successful and the rich and the avant-garde and the put together, like holy fools. This requires us to believe without seeing, to love without the promise that we'd be loved in return, and to trust that life only comes from death. It's only a fool who's going to believe this. So instead of trying to normalize ourselves, instead of trying to normalize our faith, although we do think rationally about it, so don't take this too far, I think today we need to hear the invitation to become okay with being the weirdo Catholics that we are, to become content with being fools for Christ, and to try giving the world what it really needs, which in this time of darkness and division and sadness that so many people are experiencing, a good dose of what Simeon Salos brought to the people of Emesa, a good dose of crazy faith, a heaping portion of foolish love, and a full measure of hope. Hope that there is something more. Let's pray, my friends. my fellow fools for Jesus Christ, that we will be able to become more and more okay with being the fools that we are.